The bark started before dawn. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to the quiet, sharp and desperate. It cut through the cold morning air of Ridgway, Colorado, like something urgent trying to break through a locked door. Not the bark of a dog asking for food. Not the bark of a wound startled by a passing car. This was the bark of an animal that had found something it could not ignore. Something it needed a human to see. Leah Holt lay on the narrow bed in the back room of her brother's house, staring at the ceiling, and did not move. She had been awake for hours. She had been awake in truth since the night 3 days ago, when she drove into Ridgway with nothing but a duffel bag and the particular kind of emptiness that follows a funeral. The kind of empty that doesn't fill back up right away. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone and reminds you of its weight every time you breathe. Rex was outside. She could hear him pacing. She could picture him without looking, the tight, controlled movement of his body, ears forward, tail stiff, circling back again and again to the same point in front of the garage door. A Belgian Malinois working a problem. He had always moved like that when he was certain. Not anxious. Certain. She had learned over 5 years of working beside him in places she was not allowed to name that when Rex moved like that, something was there. But she was not ready to get up. She turned onto her side and looked at the window. The Colorado mountains were barely visible in the blue pre-dawn light, ridge lines emerging slowly from the dark like they always did. She had grown up looking at those mountains. She and Cole both had. Their father used to say the mountains didn't care about your problems, and that was the most honest thing about them. Cole. She closed her eyes. Cole Holt had been 44 years old. He had been in every way that mattered the kind of person who made a town feel like a place worth living in. He ran a one-man auto repair shop behind the house where they had grown up, a concrete-floored, oil-stained operation that smelled of grease and motor cleaner, and faintly of the coffee he kept burning on a hot plate near the workbench. He fixed trucks for ranchers. He fixed tractors for the farms up the valley. He fixed school buses and delivery vans, and once, memorably, a vintage Airstream trailer belonging to a retired school teacher who didn't have enough money to pay him and gave him a jar of homemade preserves instead, which Cole accepted without complaint and finished in a week. He believed with a certainty that Leah had always found slightly unreasonable that broken things could be repaired. Cars, certainly. Homes given enough time. People if you were patient enough and didn't push too hard. He had never pushed Leah. Not when she enlisted at 19 and disappeared into the Army's Medical Corps. Not when she re-enlisted again, and then transferred into a unit whose name she couldn't put in letters home. Not when she came back the final time with a limp she pretended wasn't there, and a silence around her that most people had the sense not to probe. Cole had simply opened the door of the house where they had grown up, set a beer on the kitchen table, and put on a country radio station at low volume. He had not asked her anything. He had just let her be there. And now he was gone. A heart that had worked 44 years without complaint had simply stopped working somewhere in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, or between the last thing Cole Holt had done in the world and the first thing he had intended to do the next day. The funeral had been held 3 days after that. Half the town had shown up. Leah had stood in the back next to Rex, who wore his service vest because it helped people give him space. She had shaken hands. She had said the words that were expected of her. She had driven home in Cole's truck because her own car was still in storage at Fort Carson, and she had not yet decided what to do about that. She had not yet decided what to do about most things. Rex barked again from outside, longer this time, with a low urgency underneath it that she recognized the way you recognize a voice you've known for years. He was not going to stop. Leah sat up. She was 38 years old. She had been an Army Special Operations medic for 10 years, had served in places where the ambient temperature of staying alive required a kind of constant low-level attention that never fully switched off, not even in sleep, not even now. Years later, in a house in Colorado that smelled like her brother's coffee and engine oil. The back injury that had ended her career was a compression fracture in 2 lumbar vertebrae, sustained during an extraction in conditions she was not authorized to describe. The doctors had cleared her for civilian life. They had given her paperwork and a handshake and a list of physical therapy exercises. They had not given her anything to do after that. She pulled on her boots the way she always did, left first laces tight, a habit from years of being ready to move in under 60 seconds. She found her jacket on the chair by the door. She stepped outside into the cold. The air hit her face like a clean blade. October in Ridgeway came in hard and honest, and this morning the sky above the mountains was the pale gray of something not yet decided, somewhere between night and day. Her breath made a small cloud in front of her face. The grass was stiff with frost. Rex stood at the garage door. He turned when she came out, looked at her directly, then turned back to the garage. He barked once more, a single declarative sound. Then he was still. He had done this for 3 days, ever since they arrived. He had circled the garage, returned to it, insisted on it with the quiet relentlessness of an animal that has decided something matters and is waiting for the humans to catch up. Leah walked to the garage door and stood there for a moment, her hand on the cold metal handle. She did not know exactly why she had waited 3 days. Partly, she told herself, because the garage had always been Cole's space, not hers. She had no reason to go in. Partly because she was tired in a way that made even small decisions feel heavy. But she had also, she realized, been afraid. Not of anything specific, just afraid of finding one more piece of her brother's life that she was going to have to figure out what to do with. She lifted the handle and pulled. The door groaned as it rose, cold metal on cold metal, the sound bouncing off the quiet street. Inside the garage was dim lit only by the gray light spilling in from behind her. The smell of engine oil and metal hit her, immediately familiar and layered with memory. This was where Cole had spent most of his time, and it showed in every corner. Tools hung from a pegboard on the far wall, arranged with a care that was purely Cole's, each one outlined in black marker, so you always knew where it belonged. A chest freezer hummed near the back wall. A coffee can full of bolts sat on the workbench. On a shelf above the bench, a photograph Cole and Leah at a county fair, maybe 15 years old and 12 years old respectively, holding snow cones, squinting into the sun. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. There were two shapes in the garage, both covered with heavy canvas tarps. One was clearly a truck. The silhouette was familiar, the size consistent with the old Ford pickup Cole had been slowly restoring for the better part of 2 years. The other shape was larger, heavier, squared off in a way that didn't match any civilian vehicle she could immediately place. Rex walked straight to the second tarp. He stopped in front of it, sat down, and looked at Leah with a patience that was almost unbearable. She crossed the garage floor. Her boots were loud on the concrete in the silence. She reached down and found the edge of the tarp where it had been tied down with rope. Good thick rope, knotted the way her brother always knotted things, double-hitched, no wasted motion. She worked the knots loose. Rex did not move. He sat and watched her with those dark eyes that had on more than one occasion been the reason she was still alive. She pulled the tarp back. Dust moved through the air in a slow cloud. The light from the door caught it and made it briefly golden. And then the dust settled, and Leah Holt stood very still in the cold garage and looked at what was underneath. A Humvee, desert tan. Faded by sun in time to something paler than its original color, the way things fade when they have been somewhere hot and unforgiving for a long time. The tires were cracked along the sidewalls but still held their shape. The windshield was intact. The front bumper carried a dent on the lower left side, a crescent-shaped impact mark she recognized the way you recognize a scar on your own body without needing to think about it, without needing to look carefully. She knew this dent. She knew exactly how it had happened. She had been in the vehicle when it happened. Her feet moved before she fully decided to move them. She walked around the front of the Humvee, slowly trailing her hand along the hood, wiping away a layer of dust with her palm. The metal was cold under her fingers. She looked at the side of the vehicle at the door, and she looked at the faded but unmistakable lettering painted there in small, careful strokes. 2 words, barely visible under the grime. Ghost Unit. Leah stopped breathing. Ghost Unit had been the call sign of her team during her final deployment. Not a name from a film, not a name from a story someone told. A name that had existed in classified documents and in the mouths of 12 people, 9 of whom she still knew the faces of, and 3 of whom she no longer could think about without a particular kind of effort. The Humvee she was standing in front of, this exact vehicle, this exact dent, this exact set of scratches along the passenger side door, had been destroyed in an ambush 14 months into that deployment. She knew this because she had been on the ground 50 meters away when it happened. She knew this because the official report, which she had read in a room she was escorted into and escorted out of, used the word destroyed with a specificity that left no room for interpretation. She had not questioned it. There had been nothing left to question. She stood in her brother's garage in Ridgway, Colorado, in the pre-dawn cold of an October morning, and looked at a vehicle that did not exist. Rex had moved to the driver's side door. He was pawing at it now, not frantically, but deliberately, the way he pawed at doors when he needed them open. She walked around to his side. She put her hand on the door handle. She pulled it open. Inside, the seats had been reupholstered. New fabric brown stitched tight and cleanly. The dashboard had been cleaned and repainted. Beneath it, she could see the neat runs of new wiring zip-tied in the way a careful person ties wiring methodically, no excess. The center console had been reinforced. The floor had been relined. Cole's work. She knew it without question. She had seen him do this kind of thing her entire life. And on the steering wheel, held in place by a strip of tape, was an envelope. Plain white. Her name on the front in her brother's handwriting. Not a printed label, not a typed address. Just her name written by hand in the slightly deliberate way Cole wrote when he was trying to be legible. Leah. Her hands were steady as she reached for it. She had been trained to be steady, but she stood in the door of the Humvee for a long moment with the envelope in her hands and felt quite clearly that something was about to change. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages handwritten on the same yellow legal pad Cole had used for as long as she could remember. He had always bought them in bulk from the office supply store in Montrose. He wrote in blue pen. She read it standing up. Cole had been diagnosed with a degenerative heart condition 8 months before he died. The cardiologist had explained it clearly. The muscle was weakening in a way that could not be stopped, only managed, and the managing had limits. 12 months on the outside, the doctor had said. Possibly less. He had not told Leah. She read that sentence twice. He had not told her because he wrote, in his careful, slightly formal way, she had already carried enough. He had watched her come back from her last deployment, changed in ways she didn't talk about. He had watched her sleep badly and move carefully and look at rooms the way a person looks at rooms when they are always calculating the exits. He had decided with a particular stubbornness that had always been his defining characteristic that she did not need to know she was losing him on top of everything else. So he had not told her, and he had gone to work. He had spent 8 months tracking down this vehicle. A military surplus auction in New Mexico had listed a lot of salvaged Humvees from overseas operations, damaged, most of them stripped of sensitive components and sold for parts or restoration. He had driven down alone in the middle of a Tuesday and bought this one for $3,400, which he paid in cash from the account where he kept his savings. He had driven it home on a flatbed trailer borrowed from a rancher named Willis Pruitt, who asked no questions. And then he had started rebuilding it. He wrote about the work matter-of-factly, the way he always discussed mechanical things: suspension first, then the engine, then the electrical system, then the interior. He had sourced a first aid compartment design from a wilderness rescue manual and begun fabricating the storage units from scratch in the evenings after the repair shop closed. He had researched which radio frequencies the county emergency services used. He had looked up the specifications for emergency lighting and ordered the components from 3 different suppliers. He had done all of this in the hours that remained after running a full-time business in the year when his heart was failing. He wrote about his idea for the vehicle in the same careful way. Ridgway sat at the edge of a mountain range. In winter, the roads into the higher elevations became unreachable by standard vehicles. Every year, people were stranded. Every year, there were situations where help arrived too late because the equipment couldn't get through. Cole had thought about this for a long time. He had thought about it more, he wrote after Leah came home. He had watched her sit at the kitchen table and look out the window for long stretches of time. He had watched her eat without tasting things. He had watched her move through the days as though she was waiting for a purpose that hadn't arrived yet. He wrote, "I don't know how to fix a person. I know how to fix machines. But I think sometimes a person just needs something to point themselves at, something that matters. I thought if I gave you the vehicle and the idea, you'd figure out the rest. You always do." He wrote about the modifications still needed. He listed them in order of priority. He wrote, "I know this isn't a normal thing to leave someone. I know it probably seems like a lot to ask, but I think you can do it. I think the town needs it, and I think you need it more than you know." The letter ended there. 3-paged blue pen, yellow legal pad. No dramatic final sentence. Just the plan laid out as clearly as he could lay it out, and her name signed to nothing except the trust he had always placed in her without being asked. She stood in the garage door with the letter in her hand for a longer time. Rex had come to sit beside her. He pressed his shoulder against her left leg, a grounding weight, the same thing he did in field situations when a situation required steadiness. She put her hand on the top of his head. The sky outside the garage had lightened while she was reading. The mountains were visible now in pale blue and gray, hard-edged against the brightening sky. Somewhere down the street, a truck started up, someone heading to work, early, the world going about its ordinary business. She needed to find the paperwork for the vehicle. She needed to understand what Cole had purchased, what name it was registered, under what the legal standing of the project was. She folded the letter carefully, creased the pages the same way she creased maps in the field, and put it in the pocket of her jacket. She found the paperwork in a manila folder tucked behind the wheel arch on the driver's side, held in place by a binder clip. The folder also contained a receipt from the surplus auction, a bill of sale, a Colorado registration document, and several pages of handwritten notes in Cole's writing specifications, parts lists, contact names for the county emergency services. She found the other document at the bottom of the folder. It was a one-page legal agreement, the kind drawn up simply without ornament. Cole Holt had sold his business, the auto repair shop, the equipment, the tools, the client list, the building lease, everything that constituted the operation he had built over 20 years, the thing he had gotten up for every morning of his adult life, the thing that had made him a fixture of Ridgeway in a way that had nothing to do with his name and everything to do with the work he did. He had sold it all to a buyer named T. Garrison Reeves of Montrose for $42,000. The date on the document was 6 months ago, 9 months before Cole died, 3 months after his diagnosis. Leah sat down on the concrete floor of the garage. She did not mean to. Her legs simply made the decision without consulting her. $42,000. That was what it had taken to cover the late-stage medical bills and buy the Humvee and order the parts and fund the project he had not told her about and would not live to complete. She knew what that shop had meant to him. She had watched him build it from nothing after their father died at an age when most young men were still figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives. She had watched him take the inheritance, which was not large, and put it into a building and a set of tools and a willingness to work harder than anyone expected. She had watched him earn the trust of every rancher and farmer and contractor in a 50-mile radius, one repair at a time, over 2 decades. He had traded it all for this, not for himself. He had known when he signed that document that he would not see the finished result. He had known the odds well enough to make the calculation clearly. He had spent everything he had on a project for his sister in a year when he was dying without telling her any of it. Rex put his head in her lap. She sat on the cold concrete floor of her brother's garage in the thin October light and held the document in her hands and understood for the first time and completely what Cole had done. It was not a gift. That word was too simple. A gift implied something given from abundance. This had been given from everything. He had looked at what remained of his time and his money and his strength, and he had put all of it into a purpose he believed in for a person he loved in the quiet and deliberate way that had always been entirely Cole Holt's way of doing things. He had not told her. He had not asked permission. He had not wanted credit. He had just done the work. She stayed on the floor for a while. The garage was cold and the light was growing, and Rex breathed steadily against her, and the 2 words on the side of the Humvee were visible in her peripheral vision, ghost unit barely legible under the dust. But there, her team's call sign, her vehicle, in her brother's garage, 400 miles from where it had been last time she saw it, in a country she would never name, in a conversation she would never have, in full. She did not know yet how Cole had known. She did not know how he had found it among the lots of surplus equipment, how he had identified it, specifically how he had understood what it was or what it had meant to her. She would think about that later. She would read the letter again more carefully. She would look for the details she had missed. But she knew sitting there in the cold that he had found it on purpose. He had not simply bought a Humvee. He had bought this Humvee, the specific one, and brought it home and started rebuilding it in the time he had left. She thought about that for a long time. Outside, the town of Ridgeway was waking up. A door closed somewhere. A dog that was not Rex barked once and went quiet. The light kept coming in through the garage door, brightening by degrees catching the dust still hanging in the air from when she had pulled the tarp away. She looked at the vehicle, at the work Cole had started and not finished, at the first aid compartment framework he had built and not yet stocked, at the wiring he had laid in and not yet connected to the lights he had ordered, at the pages of notes tucked into the manila folder, the parts lists and the measurements and the phone number for the county emergency dispatch written in the margin with a small circle around it. She thought about what he had written. I know you can do it. I think the town needs it, and I think you need it more than you know. She folded the folder and set it on the floor beside her. Rex lifted his head and looked at her. She had spent 10 years pointing herself at things that needed doing in conditions where doing nothing was not an option. She had operated on wounded men in the back of moving vehicles in the dark, in temperatures that made her instruments cold to the touch. She had made decisions under pressure that she would carry for the rest of her life. She had come home to a world that moved slowly and asked little of her and felt in its quiet more disorienting than anything she had encountered in the field. She was 38 years old, and she did not know what she was for now that the thing she had been trained for was behind her. Cole had known that. He had seen it clearly the way he saw most things without making a production of it. He had looked at his little sister, and he had understood the problem, and in the time left to him, he had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had built her a mission. The morning light reached the far wall of the garage and touched the photograph on the shelf Cole and Leah at a county fair snow-cone summer sun. He was looking at the camera. She was looking at something off to the side already, somewhere else in her attention, already on her way somewhere. He had always been the one who looked forward. She had always been the one moving. She got up from the floor. She dusted off the back of her jeans with one hand. She picked up the folder. She walked to the workbench and set it down carefully next to the coffee can, full of bolts under the photograph in the light. Rex stood up beside her and shook himself once, and then was still watching her ready. The Humvee sat in the middle of the garage floor, unfinished and waiting. The mountains outside were fully visible now, bright and hard and indifferent in the morning sun. The same mountains her father had said didn't care about your problems. That was true, but they were also there every morning, solid and present, unchanged, and sometimes that was enough. Leah Holt stood in her brother's garage and looked at the vehicle she did not know she was looking for. She had no plan yet. She had no certainty about how any of it would work, or how long it would take, or whether she was the right person to do it. She had a folder full of notes written by a man who had believed she was equal to the task, and a dong who had led her here with the patient certainty of an animal that understood things before she did, and a truck with 2 words on the side that meant something only she and her team had ever been authorized to know. She had a starting point. That had always been enough. She started the next morning before the sun came up. There was no ceremony to it. No decision that felt like a decision. She simply woke at 4:30 the way she had woken every morning for 10 years, and instead of lying in the dark cataloging the silence, she got up, pulled on her boots, and walked out to the garage. Rex followed without being called. The folder was where she had left it, on the workbench next to the coffee can and beneath the photograph. She opened it and read Cole's parts list again, by the light of the single overhead fluorescent tube which flickered for a few seconds before it settled into its steady hum. She read it the way she read field briefings front to back, once for the overview, then back through it again for the specific details she had missed the first time. Cole had made the list in the order he intended to work. He had noted which items were already purchased and sitting in boxes against the back wall, which ones still needed to be ordered, which ones he had been planning to source locally. The suspension work was largely done. The engine had been rebuilt, but not yet started under load. The electrical system was laid in, but not connected at the junction box. The emergency lighting components were in a cardboard box on the floor near the driver's side wheel well, still in their original packaging, a yellow sticky note on top with the wiring diagram Cole had hand-drawn himself. She assessed what she had the way she assessed any situation with incomplete resources. Work with what's there, identify the gaps, fill them in the right order. She was not a mechanic. That was the first honest thing she admitted to herself that morning. She was a medic who understood field repairs on vehicles as a matter of survival necessity, not expertise. She knew how to change a tire in bad conditions, how to get a disabled vehicle moving again, well enough to reach a safer position, how to diagnose the most common failures under pressure. She did not know how to properly align a suspension system. She did not know how to connect a multi-channel radio array to a power source in a way that would hold up under the vibration of unpaved mountain roads. She was going to have to learn. She found a mechanic's manual for the Humvee's engine in the third cardboard box. She opened a thick, spiral-bound document with grease marks on the cover that suggested Cole had already been using it. She found two YouTube channels on her phone that a search identified as useful, run by men who rebuilt military vehicles on weekends and narrated every step with the patient detail of people who had been doing this a long time. She watched videos on her phone with the sound low propped against the wheel arch while she worked on the electrical junction box with the wiring diagram beside her. The first full week produced three things: a functional connection between the battery array and the overhead emergency lights, a driver's side window that no longer rattled in its frame, and a pulled muscle in her left shoulder from lying on concrete for too long at an awkward angle. She did not stop. She had a routine within 4 days: up before light garage until noon, eat whatever was in Cole's refrigerator that hadn't expired, back in the garage until the light failed. The October cold settled deeper into the mornings as the weeks passed, and she started wearing an extra layer under her jacket, and she moved a space heater from the house into the garage, which Rex immediately positioned himself in front of in a way that blocked most of its output for anyone else. She did not mind. Routines were how she managed. She had always known that about herself. Give her a structure and she could operate inside it almost indefinitely. It was the unstructured time that got difficult, the evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet and there was no task to organize herself around. Those hours she spent with a book she wasn't really reading, or outside on the porch with Rex, watching the mountains go dark, in the long, slow way they did, outline by outline, until there was only sky. She did not sleep well, but she had not slept well in years, and this was a familiar enough problem that she had learned to work around it rather than through it. She was 3 weeks in when Frank Darby first spoke to her. She had seen him before that. He lived in the house directly to the north, separated from Cole's property by a fence line of weathered cedar posts and 2 strands of wire. He was 62 years old, a fact she had learned from a conversation Cole had mentioned in a letter years ago. He kept to himself. He had a truck that he drove to the hardware store on Fridays, and a yard that was functional rather than cared for, and a quality of stillness about him that was not peaceful so much as hardened, like something that had been under pressure long enough to set that way. She had caught him watching the garage, twice from across the fence while she was hauling boxes in from the truck, once from his own front porch while she was testing the emergency lights which lit up the garage entrance in a red and white pulse that was probably visible from the road. He had not waved. He had not come over. He had simply watched with the kind of expression that was not quite disapproval and not quite curiosity, and landed somewhere between them. On the morning of the 23rd day, she was under the Humvee on the concrete floor, working on the rear suspension linkage with a manual and a flashlight, and diminishing confidence when she heard the gate in the fence line open and close. She heard his footsteps cross the gravel to the garage door. She did not come out from under the vehicle. That linkage arm on the driver's rear, his voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not use more words than necessary. You've got it torqued wrong. You go out on a mountain road with like that, the whole assembly's going to let go on the first hard turn. Leah slid out from under the Humvee and looked up at Frank Darby from the floor. He was a large man, not tall, but solid, the kind of solid that came from decades of physical work rather than effort at a gym. He had gray hair cut very short, in a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors, and showed it. He was holding a torque wrench in his right hand, a good one, the kind that costs real money and lasts 30 years. He was looking at the Humvee, not at her. She stood up. He glanced at her briefly, then back at the vehicle. I was 8 years Army, motor pool. I know these things. He said nothing else. He walked to the driver's side rear wheel well and crouched down and looked at the linkage arm with the focused attention of someone who has been looking at mechanical problems long enough that they see them the way other people see something obvious. He pointed without speaking, indicating the issue. She looked where he was pointing. He was right. She handed him the manual. He glanced at the relevant page, handed it back, and held out his hand for the wrench she had been using. She gave it to him. He worked in silence for 11 minutes. She watched and noted what he was doing and why. When he was finished, he stood up and handed the wrench back to her. She said, "Thank you." He nodded once. He looked at the Humvee for a moment longer, at the faded lettering on the door, at the emergency light array on the roof, at the medical storage framework Cole had built into the rear. Something moved across his expression, not quite recognition, something closer to understanding. Then he turned and walked back across the gravel and through the gate, and it closed behind him. He came back the next evening. He brought his own tools this time. He set them down without ceremony and looked at the junction box she had been working on and said without preamble that the ground wire was going to be a problem in cold weather and showed her how to fix it. She worked beside him for 3 hours and asked questions when she had them, and he answered them with the economy of a man who respected the question enough not to waste time around the answer. He did not explain himself. He did not apologize for what had preceded this. He simply showed up and brought his knowledge and worked. She understood that. She had known men who operated this way her entire adult life. Words were not the currency. Showing up was. Chief Brenda Voss had come around on the fourth day after the garage, which meant she had come sooner than anyone else and with more practical information. She was 45 years old and ran the Ridgeway Fire Station with an efficiency that the town took for granted because it had never failed them. She knocked on the front door at 7 in the morning, and when Leah opened it, she handed her a cup of coffee from the drive-thru in town and said she had heard about the project. She did not ask for details. She had already understood the details from whatever network of information ran through a small town, that particular invisible current that connected everyone to everything without anyone broadcasting anything. She asked two specific questions. What radio frequencies was Leah planning to run, and did she have a county emergency services registration in mind? Then she said that if the answers to those questions led where she expected, she might have some equipment in storage that would be relevant. She left 20 minutes later. She came back 2 days after that with a radio set from the station's surplus inventory, still functional frequencies, already programmed for the county emergency channels, and a typed list of the certifications the vehicle would need to operate as a formal auxiliary rescue unit. She left the list on the workbench with a pen on top of it and said, "Some of this is optional, some of it isn't. I've marked which is which." Then she left again. That was how Brenda Voss operated. She did not linger. She identified the practical need, addressed it, and moved on to the next thing. Leah respected this enormously. Other people came in the weeks that followed. Not many and not loudly. This was Ridgeway, a town that did not perform its generosity, but they came. A retired nurse named Dorothy Pruitt, whose husband had been the rancher who lent Cole the flatbed trailer, appeared one Saturday morning with 2 large plastic totes of medical supplies, each item labeled in the careful way of someone who had spent decades knowing exactly where things needed to be. She spent 2 hours with Leah going through the medical storage compartment Cole had built, suggesting changes to the layout, explaining which configurations would hold up under movement and which would not. A man from the volunteer fire company, whose name was Bud, showed up one evening with a length of high-pressure hydraulic hose that he said was the right type for the winch system Cole had planned, and he was right. He did not explain how he knew. He set the hose down and had a look at the winch mounting. Points Cole had reinforced said they were solid, and left. The town knew about the project. The town was doing what small towns do when they decide something matters, contributing quietly without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, because that was how things got done and had always gotten done in places where people understood that the help you give today may be the help you need tomorrow. Through all of this, Rex was present. He moved through the garage with the comfortable authority of an animal who has decided that a space belongs to him. He slept near the Humvee. He watched the people who came and went with a calm attention that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply observant. When Frank Darby was working, Rex sometimes positioned himself a few feet away and watched the work with the focused interest of a student, which Frank appeared to find either amusing or acceptable because he never told the dog to move. It was in the 5th week on a Tuesday evening when the garage was quiet and Frank had gone home for the night and Rex was asleep in the corner that Leah found the notebook. She had been cleaning the workbench, organizing the tools that had accumulated over the weeks of work, putting them back on the pegboard in the order the black outlines indicated. She pulled the bottom drawer of the rolling toolbox open to look for a missing socket, and there it was. Not a letter, not a document. A spiral-bound notebook, the same black-covered kind Cole had used for as long as she could remember, the cheap kind that comes in packs of 5 from the drugstore. His name was not on it. There was nothing on the cover at all. She opened it. The first pages were technical. Cole's handwriting dense and precise, filling line after line with notes on the Humvee's mechanical systems measurements, part numbers, torque specifications, sketches of components with dimensions labeled in the margins. This was a working document. This was how Cole thought through problems by writing every step down, forcing the sequence into a visible order that he could check and revise. She turned the pages slowly. The technical notes continued for about a third of the notebook. Then they changed, not abruptly. There was a page where the notes shifted from a parts list to something else without any marking or heading to indicate the transition. She had been turning pages, quickly skimming for anything useful, and she almost missed it. She turned back. Cole's handwriting was the same pen, but the sentences were different. He had written, "The suspension is holding, tested it on the back road past Pruitt's property this morning. Good result. Should handle the grade up to Dry Creek Pass without trouble if the tires are right." And then 2 lines down, "Without any break or separation, Leah called last week." She sounds tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. She always thinks I don't notice, but I've been watching her my whole life. Leah went still. She stood at the workbench with the notebook in her hands and read what her brother had written about her in the margins of a mechanical journal in the year when he was dying and working and keeping both of those facts largely to himself. He had written about her practical qualities, first the way he noticed everything, her ability to assess a situation without being told what to look for, the speed of her physical work, when she knew what she was doing, the way she could learn a new skill if she trusted the source of the information. He noted these things with the same matter-of-fact precision he used for suspension measurements, as though he was documenting something real and useful. And then further along in an entry that had no date, "I don't know if she'll think this was the right decision. I don't know if she'll want any of this. She might be angry. She has a right to be. But I couldn't think of another way to tell her what I think she's worth without her dismissing it. She dismisses things people say. She doesn't dismiss things that are real." And later, near the end of the technical sections, a single line that was not about the vehicle and not about a mechanical problem, "I just want her to know she belongs somewhere." I think she forgot that. Leah set the notebook down on the workbench. She stood in the cold garage under the flickering fluorescent light, with her hands flat on the metal surface of the workbench, and she understood something she had not understood before, which was that her brother had not simply left her a project. He had left her a record of how he had seen her. Clearly, honestly, without the softening that people apply to their observations when they expect to be in the room when those observations are heard. He had written it for her in the only language he was fully fluent in, which was the language of work and problem solving and careful documented attention to the things that mattered. He had hidden it where she would find it if she went looking in a drawer in his toolbox in his garage, in the project that had been his way of saying everything he hadn't said out loud. Rex had woken up at some point and crossed the garage to where she stood. He pushed his head under her hand. She stood there with her hand on her dog's head and her eyes on the notebook and the cold air of the garage around her. And for the first time since she had come back to Ridgeway, since the phone call in the middle of the night and the drive up through the dark and the funeral and the silence of the house afterwards, she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way a person cries when they have been holding something for a very long time, and suddenly there is no longer a reason to hold it, which is quietly with a steadiness that is almost indistinguishable from composure until you look closely. Rex pressed against her leg and did not move. She cried for a while. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the same gesture she had used since she was a child, and she looked at the Humvee. Cole had written, "She doesn't dismiss things that are real." The vehicle in front of her was as real as anything she had ever seen. The work continued. November came into Ridgeway on a cold front that pushed the temperature down fast and kept it there. The mornings arrived dark and hard frozen, the frost thick on the garage windows, and Leah worked in 2 layers with the space heater going at full output and Rex parked directly in front of it. Frank Darby showed up 3 evenings a week without being asked and worked alongside her with the reliable competence of a man who had been fixing things with his hands for 40 years and had not lost the habit. They talked more as the weeks passed, not much and not about the things that sat underneath the surface of both their lives, not about the military, not about the years between service and now, not about the particular kind of difficulty that attaches to men and women who have been trained for conditions that no longer apply to them. They talked about the work, about the vehicle, about the county roads and which ones were worst in winter and how a winch would need to be mounted to be functional in a narrow pass. But sometimes while they were working, Frank would say something that wasn't about the vehicle. He said one evening while tracing a wire along the floor of the rear compartment, "Cole came by the house last spring, wanted me to come to some veterans group in town. I told him to mind his own business. He said it the same way he said mechanical things. Flat, direct, undecorated." Leah waited. "He didn't take it personally. That was Cole." Frank paused. He connected the wire to the terminal and tested the connection. "He never took things personally. He just kept showing up." She understood what he was saying without needing him to say it more clearly. Cole had seen something in Frank Darby the same way he had seen something in her. He had tried to do something about it the same way. And Frank had refused, and Cole had died, and now Frank Darby was in a dead man's garage at 9 in the evening in November fixing the electrical system of a vehicle that the dead man had spent his last good months rebuilding, and neither of them needed to say what that meant. She said he had a way of doing that. Frank nodded. He went back to the wiring. The work took 11 weeks in total. Not because the work itself required 11 weeks, but because Leah was learning as she went, because parts arrived on schedules that were not always convenient, and because she did everything with a thoroughness that approached the standards she would have applied to equipment going into an operational environment. Because it was. She was not building a vehicle for demonstration purposes. She was building a vehicle that would go into the mountains in conditions that could kill the people it was going to, and it needed to work. She tested the winch in the field behind the house pulling a dead tree trunk up a slope in the snow. She tested the suspension on the back roads, the ones with the most significant grade changes pushing the vehicle through ruts and over washboard at varying speeds while Frank sat in the passenger seat and noted any instability. She tested the medical compartment by running through a full field trauma kit setup with the vehicle running and the heater going, timing herself, identifying what needed to be repositioned. Chief Brenda Voss came back 3 times during the build. She was not sentimental about any of it. She was interested in specifics, load capacity, response time, radio range certified operator qualifications. She and Leah went through the certification list together during the second visit and identified which courses Leah needed to complete to bring the vehicle into formal auxiliary status with the county emergency system. Leah completed them all within 6 weeks. On the last Saturday of November, Brenda Voss stood in the driveway with a clipboard and a county registration form and conducted the kind of inspection she was qualified to conduct, which was thorough and unanticipated in its thoroughness, and yielded 2 items that needed adjustment before sign-off. Leah fixed both items the same afternoon. The paperwork was signed the following Monday. The vehicle was registered as Ridgeway Auxiliary Rescue Unit 1. The address on the registration was the house on Mesa View Road. The operator of record was Leah Holt. That evening, she pulled the Humvee out of the garage and into the driveway for the first time since she had taken the tarp off. The November air was clear and very cold, and the stars over the mountains were hard and bright, the way they get at altitude when there is no cloud cover and no humidity and nothing between you and the distance. She stood beside the vehicle and looked at it. The emergency lights, when she switched them on, swept the driveway in red and white, catching the frost on the ground. The engine ran with a steadiness that had not been there before the rebuilt components. The new timing, the careful work of months, evident in the sound of it, deep and even, and without complaint. Cole had bought a wreck and started making it something. She had taken what he started and made it something further. Rex came out of the garage behind her. He walked to the passenger side of the Humvee and stood there with his tail level looking at the door. She opened it. He jumped in. He turned twice in the seat the way dogs turn a habit so old it had outlasted the landscapes it was bred for, and settled into the seat with his head up and his eyes forward. He was wearing his work harness. He looked in the sweep of the emergency lights exactly the way he had looked in the passenger seat of vehicles in places far from here, in years that were behind both of them. Ready. She looked at the 2 words on the door. Ghost unit still there under the light, the paint worn but visible. She had not repainted it. She had cleaned the door and preserved everything Cole had preserved and left the lettering as it was. Her unit's call sign in the mountains where she had grown up. Her brother's work finished in the time that remained to her. She thought about what he had written in the notebook. I just want her to know she belongs somewhere. She got in the driver's seat. The engine was warm. The radio crackled once on the county emergency frequency and then went to its low standby tone. The mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, enormous and indifferent, and they're the same as always, the same as they had been when she was 12 years old, with a snow cone at a county fair, and Cole was standing beside her. She sat in the vehicle for a few minutes, not going anywhere, just listening to the engine, just being in the thing that had been built for her by a man who knew her better than she had understood while he was still alive to know her. Outside, the town was quiet. The lights of Ridgeway made a small, warm glow against the cold, the way small towns do in winter, contained deliberate a thing that had been maintained by the people in it because they had decided it was worth maintaining. Rex breathed steadily beside her. She put the Humvee in gear. She drove to the end of the road and turned around and came back, and when she pulled back into the driveway and shut the engine off, the silence that followed was different from the silence she had been living in for months. It was not the silence of an empty house. It was the silence that comes after a thing is ready. She had a vehicle. She had a purpose. She had a set of skills that had spent years pointing at a world that no longer needed them in the way they had been trained, and she had a place finally to point them. She sat in the cold driveway and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. She was not waiting anymore. The first call came on a Wednesday morning in December, 6 days after the vehicle was certified. A rancher named Whitfield had gone out before dawn to check on cattle in the upper pasture and not come back. His wife called the county line at 7. The road to the upper pasture crossed a creek bed that had frozen overnight and then partially thawed and refrozen in a configuration that a standard truck could not cross safely. The sheriff's department had a vehicle at the creek crossing by 7:30 and no way past it. Brenda Voss called Leah at 7:42. Leah and Rex were in the field beside the Whitfield property by 8:15. The Humvee crossed the creek bed without difficulty, the suspension, handling the uneven surface the way it had been rebuilt to handle it, the weight distribution holding through the soft shoulder on the far side. She found the rancher half a mile up the trail standing beside his truck with a broken ankle sustained when he stepped wrong, getting out to open a gate in the dark. He was cold and annoyed and largely fine. She splinted the ankle in the field, using the kit from the medical compartment. She drove him back across the creek and handed him to the paramedics on the other side. She was home by 10. It was not a dramatic rescue. It was not the kind of thing that would be remembered beyond the people immediately involved. But it was real, and it had required exactly what the vehicle had been built to provide, and it had worked. She wrote the call up in the log she had started keeping: date, time, nature of the call, response time, outcome, anything notable about the road conditions or equipment performance. She kept the log on the workbench in the garage in a binder, the same way Cole had kept his repair records. She noted what had worked and what she would do differently. She noted that the medical kit needed a second SAM splint added to the inventory. She added the SAM splint the same afternoon. December moved through Ridgeway with the particular deliberateness of mountain winters, each week colder and darker than the one before the snowpack building on the high ridges and beginning to creep down toward the valley roads. The calls were infrequent but steady: a stranded vehicle on the Owl Creek Road, a hiker who had pushed too far on a trail that closed for the season and gotten turned around in deteriorating conditions, a medical delivery to an elderly woman on a ranch road that had been blocked by a downed tree for 3 days and whose prescription could not wait another 3. Each call logged, each one handled. The town began to know the sound of the Humvee, the particular tone of its engine, low and deliberate, moving through the early morning or the late evening on its way somewhere. People heard it and knew what it meant and went back to sleep or went back to what they were doing, which was exactly what it was supposed to mean. Frank Darby drove 2 of the calls in December when Leah was dealing with a recurrence of the back injury that required 3 days of limited movement. He drove with a quiet competence that surprised no one who knew his background and called Leah after each run to give her a debrief with the same flat economy of language he used for everything. She updated the log based on his reports. He had joined the veterans group by then. He had not announced it. She had found out from Dorothy Pruitt, who mentioned it the way people in small towns mention things they are pleased about but are too tactful to make a point of, in passing attached to something else, as though the information were incidental. Dorothy had said, while reorganizing the medical kit inventory, that it was good to see Frank getting out a bit more, and Leah had understood what she meant. Cole had tried to open that door once. Frank had slammed it. But Cole had not been wrong about what was on the other side of it, and eventually the door had opened anyway, in the way things sometimes open when the right circumstances accumulate around them. Not because of anything dramatic, because a man had shown up every evening for 11 weeks and worked in a garage beside someone who did not require him to explain himself, and that had been enough to start something moving that had not been moving before. January arrived. The snowpack on the high routes above Ridgeway was 20% above the seasonal average. The County Road Department issued an advisory about Route 550 north of town, which climbed to over 11,000 feet at its highest point and carried a significant number of people who did not fully understand what that elevation meant in a serious winter storm. Brenda Voss added the advisory to the briefing she sent Leah every Monday morning, a single type page that covered weather forecasts, road condition reports, and any county emergency communications relevant to the auxiliary unit. Leah read the advisory and noted the elevation profile and filed it in the binder. On the 14th of January, the National Weather Service issued a winter storm warning for the San Juan Mountains. The forecast was for 18 to 24 inches of new snow above 9,000 feet, with wind gusts to 50 miles per hour on the exposed ridges and a rapid temperature drop overnight that would make road surfaces dangerous before the snow totals became the primary problem. The service used the phrase significant travel impacts, which was their careful way of saying that anyone caught out in it was going to be in serious trouble. The storm arrived at roughly the time the forecast predicted, which was late afternoon, and it arrived with the unhurried certainty of weather systems that have been building for a longer time and intend to complete what they started. By 6 in the evening, the snow was heavy and the wind was picking up, and the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees above zero and was still falling. Leah was in the house when the call came. Not watching the weather with any particular anxiety, she had checked the forecast that morning and made sure the Humvee was fueled and the medical kit was fully stocked, and the radio was charged, because that was what you did when a significant weather event was coming, and then you went about your evening. She was eating at the kitchen table when the radio on the counter crackled with the county emergency frequency. The voice of the dispatcher was calm in the way trained dispatchers are calm, which is not the absence of urgency, but the management of it. A vehicle had left the road on Route 550, approximately 22 miles north of Ridgeway. 2 adults, a man and a woman. The woman was in active labor. The road was impassable for standard emergency vehicles due to snow accumulation and ice. An ambulance had attempted the route and turned back at mile marker 7. The State Patrol had a unit on scene but could not transport. They needed something that could reach mile marker 22. Leah was already moving before the dispatcher finished the transmission. She pulled on her gear with the speed and sequence of 10 years of doing it in darkness base layer, already on fleece jacket, gloves, hat, boots. She checked the kit by feel and confirmed by sight. She switched the radio to the county frequency and keyed it to let dispatch know she was responding. She got the Humvee started and let it run for 45 seconds, while Rex jumped into the passenger seat and she pulled the garage door closed behind her. The storm hit her as soon as she cleared the driveway. The wind drove the snow horizontally across the road, the headlights turning it into a wall of white that obscured the lane markings and reduced visibility to perhaps 30 feet. She drove at the speed the conditions permitted, which was not fast, and held her line by the position of the embankments on either side of the road, in the memory of having driven this route in every kind of weather since she was old enough to have a license. The county radio stayed active throughout the drive. The State Patrol officer on scene gave her condition updates every few minutes in the clipped, organized way of someone who has been doing field work long enough to communicate usefully under pressure. The woman's contractions were close. The vehicle had gone off the road on the right shoulder, and the front right wheel was in the ditch, but the vehicle itself was upright and intact. The temperature inside the vehicle was dropping. Leah acknowledged each update and kept driving. The road north of town climbed steadily, switchbacking up through the canyon in long, arcing curves that the Humvee handled at reduced speed without complaint. The suspension absorbed the ruts left by vehicles that had turned back earlier. The tires, rated for deep snow, found purchase on surfaces that would have stopped something lighter and lower. At mile marker 14, she passed a county plow truck that had pulled to the side. the driver watching her headlights go by with an expression she could not see but could imagine. At mile marker 18, the road leveled out briefly at a wide spot the locals called Aspen Flats, a half-mile of relatively straight road before the next switchback series began. The snow here was deeper, the trees that lined the lower road gave way to open terrain, and the wind had been working the surface unobstructed, and she slowed further and felt the Humvee settle into the work of moving through it. At mile marker 22, the headlights caught the reflective strip of the State Patrol unit parked on the shoulder, emergency lights strobing weakly through the snow. Beyond it on the right side was the vehicle in the ditch, a dark-colored SUV, front right corner, dropped hazard lights blinking with the stubborn optimism of hazard lights everywhere. She pulled in behind the patrol unit and got out. The cold was immediate and serious. The wind cut through the outer layer of her jacket, and she felt it in her face and hands within seconds. She pulled her kit from the rear compartment and went to the patrol officer first. He was young, late 20s, standing at the door of his cruiser with his jacket collar up and his face tight with the controlled alertness of someone who has been holding a situation together by himself for longer than he expected to. He gave her a rapid handover, the way field personnel give handovers, named situation time on scene current status. The woman's name was Mara Calloway. Her husband was Garrett. She was 34 weeks along contractions, 4 minutes apart, and had been in the vehicle for approximately 90 minutes since they went off the road. I kept the engine running as long as I could, he said. Fuel got low. I moved them to my cruiser 20 minutes ago, but the heater's struggling to keep up. She nodded and crossed to the cruiser. Garrett Calloway was in the back seat with his wife, one arm around her shoulders, talking to her in a low, steady voice that was doing the work that low, steady voices do in those situations. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the face of a man who is frightened and refusing to show it as an act of deliberate will on behalf of the person beside him. He looked up when Leah opened the door, and his expression went through several things in rapid succession before settling on relief. Mara Calloway was 34 weeks pregnant and in active labor and had been sitting in a car on the side of a mountain road in a blizzard for over an hour, and she was, despite all of that, more composed than the situation warranted. She looked at Leah directly and said, "The contractions are getting faster." "I know," Leah said. "I'm going to take care of you. Let's get you into my vehicle. It's warmer, and I have what I need in there." It took 4 minutes to move Mara from the cruiser to the Humvee. 4 minutes in the wind, in the snow, with Garrett on one side and Leah on the other, and the patrol officer holding the door. 4 minutes of careful, deliberate movement. And then they were inside, and the door was closed, and the heater was running, and the wind was aimed outside where it belonged. Leah had the rear compartment configured for exactly this. Not because she had specifically anticipated this scenario in its particulars, but because Cole had designed the space with the Wilderness Rescue Manual's protocols in mind, and she had refined it through the months of preparation in what they had built together. Cole, in the months before his death, and she in the months after, was a functional emergency medical space inside a vehicle that could go where standard ambulances could not. She pulled gloves from the kit. She set out what she needed in the order she would need it. The labor had progressed further than the initial report suggested. She worked with the focused economy of a medic who has been in difficult field conditions enough times that the technical requirements of the situation occupy the front of the mind completely, leaving no room for anything else. She spoke to Mara clearly and calmly, explaining each step using the tone she had used in field settings for years. Not the tone of someone performing calm, but the tone of someone who actually is calm, which is a different thing and which Mara recognized for what it was and responded to accordingly. Garrett held his wife's hand and did not get in the way, and said the right things at the right moments, which is not a small thing. Rex had moved to the far end of the rear compartment and lay flat with his head on his paws, still and quiet, in the way he was still and quiet when situations required it. His presence in the vehicle was a warm weight, a steadiness. It was 31 minutes from the time Leah moved Mara into the Humvee. The baby arrived with the unambiguous decisiveness of new life, asserting itself regardless of circumstances, and Leah caught her with practiced hands in the warm rear compartment of a rebuilt military vehicle on the side of a mountain in the worst storm in 20 years, and the sound the baby made in the first seconds of her life went out into the space and filled it completely. Mara Calloway cried. Garrett Calloway pressed his face against the back of his wife's head, and his shoulders moved once, and then he was still. The patrol officer who had climbed into the front passenger seat to stay out of the cold and could hear everything through the partition said something very quietly that was not intended for anyone in particular. Leah checked the baby with the thoroughness the situation required. Everything she found to be as it should be. She wrapped the infant in the thermal blanket from the kit and placed her against her mother and stood up as straight as the rear compartment allowed and let herself breathe for a moment. Outside, the storm continued. The wind rocked the vehicle slightly on its frame. The heater ran steadily. It was in that moment, in the warmth of the compartment, with the baby breathing and Mara holding her and Garrett with his face still close to his wife's, that Garrett spoke. He said, "We almost went to Denver for the delivery." He said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, the way people say things when they are coming down from a high and the words simply surface. "A friend of ours convinced us to use a doctor here in Ridgeway instead. He said the doctor here was the best he'd worked with for a difficult pregnancy." He paused. "His name was Cole Holt. He fixed our car 2 summers ago when we broke down on the highway coming through town. We stayed in touch." Leah had been reaching for the supply kit. She stopped. "He was like that," Garrett said. "He would just look out for people, quietly. He found out about the pregnancy from something Mara mentioned, and he started sending emails about the regional prenatal care options. He was very thorough." A pause. "We heard he passed away. I'm sorry. He was a good man." The rear compartment was very quiet. "He knew we were coming in January," Garrett continued, not knowing what he was saying, not knowing the full weight the words were carrying in the space where he was saying them. "He was the one who suggested we make the trip before the late-term restriction. He said the mountain roads in February could be difficult, and it was better to get established with the doctor before then." He looked down at the baby in his wife's arms. "I don't know if he thought about what might happen on a road like this, but it feels like something he would have thought about." Leah stood in the rear compartment of the Humvee on the side of Route 550 in the middle of a blizzard and understood what she was hearing. Cole had known the Callaways were coming. He had known they would be traveling mountain roads in January and winter, in a region where the weather could produce exactly the conditions they were sitting in now. He had designed the medical compartment of this vehicle with wilderness obstetric protocols in the manual he had sourced. He had built the storage configuration that had just provided everything she needed. He had not told her any of this. He had not needed to. He had simply done the work and put the knowledge in the places where it would be found and trusted that the rest would follow. The same way he had always done things. The same way he had bought a vehicle and rebuilt it and left a letter and a notebook in a garage in Ridgeway and waited for his sister to find her way to them. She sat down on the bench of the rear compartment. Rex lifted his head and looked at her. She looked at the infant in Mara Calloway's arms, a girl small and certain and new, wrapped in the thermal blanket from the kit Cole had specified in the manual he had marked up and left in a cardboard box for her to find. She thought about a man who had spent the last months of his life building something he would not live to see used for people he loved and people he barely knew, because he had looked at the world around him and identified what was needed and done what he could with the time he had left. She thought he didn't know it would be this. He just made sure that if it was, you'd be ready. The radio crackled. Brenda Voss's voice checking status. Leah keyed the radio and gave the report in the standard format, patient stable newborn delivered en route, as soon as roads permitted. She kept her voice even. She kept it professional. When she set the radio down, Garrett Calloway was looking at her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Leah Holt," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then Holt. He looked at her. "Cole's sister." "Yes," he nodded slowly. He looked at his daughter, then back at Leah. "He talked about you," he said. "He was proud of you. I don't know if he ever told you that." She did not answer immediately. "No," she said finally. "He didn't tell me." "He told us," Garrett said simply. The storm began to ease around 2 in the morning, the way mountain storms ease, not in all at once but in degrees, the wind dropping first, then the snow thinning, then a clearing starting in the northwest, where the sky went from solid black to a deep blue that was the first sign of stars. By 3, the state road crew had to plow through to mile marker 22, and Leah drove the Humvee down the mountain ahead of it, Mara and the baby in the rear, Garrett in the front passenger seat, Rex on the floor of the rear compartment with his head near Mara's feet. At the hospital in Ridgeway, in the parking lot at 4 in the morning, With the storm-cleared sky enormous overhead, Garrett Calloway stopped beside the Humvee before he went inside. He said, "We're going to name her Cole." He said it the way he said everything directly without ornamentation as a statement of what was true. Leah stood in the Cole parking lot and looked at him for a moment. "She'd have liked that," Leah said. He, he would have liked that." Garrett nodded. He went inside. She drove home in the blue pre-dawn quiet, the streets of Ridgeway empty and still after the storm, the snow on the ground clean and undisturbed in the windless air that follows bad weather. The mountains were visible again, the peaks white against the sky moving from black to deep blue to the first pale edge of morning. She pulled the Humvee into the driveway and sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the engine running, the heater-warm Rex a steady presence behind her. She thought about a photograph on a shelf in the garage, Cole and Leah at a county fair, snow-cone summer sun. He was looking at the camera. She was looking somewhere else, already in motion. She had been in motion her whole life, moving toward the next thing, the next deployment, the next mission, the way she had been trained to move, always forward, always away. She had not understood until she came back here that she had also always been in motion away from this, away from the place she came from, away from the person who had known her longest, away from the version of herself that existed in this valley before the army made her into something harder and more directed. Cole had not tried to call her back. He had waited, and in the last time he had done it in the only way that would work for someone like her. Not with words, not with an invitation, but with a vehicle and a purpose and a mission. She got out of the Humvee and went to the garage and opened the door. The space looked different now than it had in October. The second tarp was still folded neatly on the shelf where she had put it the day she pulled it off the Humvee. Cole's tools were on the pegboard in their outlines. The photograph was on the shelf. The notebook was in the drawer of the rolling toolbox where she had found it because she had put it back there, and she went to get it sometimes in the evenings and read the parts that were not about mechanics. She stood in the garage in the early morning quiet and looked at the space her brother had built and rebuilt over 20 years, and she thought about everything that had been made here and everything that had been started here and everything that would continue from here. Rex came in behind her and went to his spot near the space heater and lay down. Later that week, Brenda Voss came by with a piece of metal the size of a license plate, painted black with letters cut and welded in clean white metal. She held it up without ceremony. It read, "Ridgeway Mountain Rescue established in memory of Cole Holt." She handed it to Leah and said she figured Leah would want to decide where it went. Leah carried it into the garage and stood for a moment looking at the walls. She put it above the workbench below the photograph where the light from the fluorescent tube fell on it directly, where Cole had stood every day for 20 years, where the coffee can full of bolts sat and the manual lay and the binder of call logs was growing page by page with the record of work being done. She stepped back and looked at it. Brenda Voss stood in the garage door with her hands in her jacket pockets. Frank Darby had come over when he saw the truck in the driveway and was standing just behind Voss, not quite inside the garage the way he stood in doorways, sometimes present, but not presuming. The three of them were quiet for a moment. Rex did not move from his spot. Leah looked at the sign and thought about the morning 3 months ago when she had stood in this garage in the blue pre-dawn light and pulled a tarp off a vehicle she did not expect to find and read a letter from a man who had known exactly what she needed before she knew herself. She thought about the notebook and what was written in it. She thought about a baby girl in a Ridgeway hospital room with a name that was also a man who had been gone since October and who was somehow more present in this town now than he had been in a long time. She thought about what it means to leave something behind, not a name on a building or a sum of money or a formal record of achievement. The actual thing, the thing left in the world by the fact of having been in it, the changes made to the people and places you were close to, the quiet alterations that compound over time and become things no one can fully trace back to their source, but which are real nonetheless. Cole Holt had left a garage and a vehicle in a notebook and a name now given to a child on a mountain road in a blizzard. He had left Frank Darby going to a veterans group on Thursday evenings. He had left his sister standing in the valley where they had grown up, knowing for the first time in years that she intended to stay. None of it had been announced. None of it had required announcement. It had simply been the accumulated result of a man who had paid attention to the people around him and done what he could with what he had. That was the whole of it. That was enough. She turned from the sign and looked at the garage, at the tools in their outlines, at Rex asleep on the concrete, at the notebook in its drawer, at the morning light, coming in through the door and falling across the floor in a long, pale rectangle that reached all the way to the workbench where the binder sat, and the work continued and would continue. Outside, the mountains stood in the clean winter air, unchanged and absolute, the same as they had always been. Her father had said they didn't care about your problems. That was true. But they were also there every morning without fail, solid in all weather, present in all seasons, and she understood now that there was a kind of generosity in that, in simply being there reliably in the place where you had always been, so that the people who needed something steady to look toward could find it. She had been looking toward them her whole life without understanding that she was one of the things that made this valley what it was, that she was part of what was worth returning to, that the place had been keeping a space open for her in the patient way that places keep spaces open for the people who belong to them, waiting without urgency, certain they would come back. She was back. She intended to stay.